I'll try to keep you awake in the next 50 minutes. I know this is a difficult task, especially talking about benchmarking. I hope it is something of your interest. So we have a few items on the menu. I think for those of you who were here, well, or at DevCon last year, there is a sort of continuity with what we have done and what we presented last year. I did the same presentation at DevCon last year, and it was really about presenting all the new features around Alfresco 4.0 in terms of scalability of the product. The good thing that this year, we actually have the proofs. I promised last year that we would get into a more formal benchmarking process, and that's what actually happened, and we invested a lot in that. There is a benchmark team. It's led by Hulley, who will be presenting with me the last part of the presentation. That is actually going to show you the new benchmark framework that has been made available that you can use to actually test your own Alfresco instance, okay? So I would say before going into the benchmarking, which is obviously the main topic of today, I think I want to spend a couple of minutes on why we really need benchmarking. I'm sure that you had experiences or parts of your sales process or with your projects where you needed reference benchmarking data. But I think I want to spend a couple of slides on, I think there is a lot of fuzz sometimes around the concept of scalability. I've been asked questions which are sometimes not really well formed in terms of what does scalability mean. So I would like to really spend a couple of slides on what does scalability mean in the context of Alfresco ECM, so that you can better understand what were the objectives and what we try to achieve with the benchmarks. So I think the first thing that we want to start with is about being very clear on the fact that there's no such thing as one size fits all, yeah? As you can obviously see from the example. And that's particularly true when you talk about developing on a platform like Alfresco, which is, yes, a very scalable by design content platform, but it can be adapted to many different use cases. So it really depends on what you are doing with Alfresco that will determine the type of requirements in terms of scalability, and obviously the type of sizing and architecture that you're going to deploy. So just as a reminder, when you download Alfresco, that is configured for a user evaluation. Yeah? The idea of the version that you download, either the enterprise trial or Alfresco community, is that it's just about evaluating it. Then you will have to tune it and make it fit for the size of your implementation. So I think just this little initial hat. I'm not going to go too much into the detail of this slide, but it's a very, I would say, nice, oh, doesn't even show it all, but can we maybe move a little bit? So basically, once again, reinstating the point that it's really about what you do with it. Yeah. So I'll come to that a bit more later and describing really the scenarios that we have been benchmarking. But you have worked with Alfresco. You know that over the years we supported so many different use cases, from document management to web content management to collaboration, and lately even more, reaching the extended enterprise, cloud, and all sort of different integrations. I mean, I work now in consultancy for 6 years on Alfresco, and I've really seen at least 20, 30 different patterns of implementation and of use cases implemented on Alfresco. So just, once again, pick your battle and try to tune the system with respect to your scenario. Now, that's what we just said. I think the first important point that obviously we had to take into account when we benchmarked Alfresco, but I think it's really important also for you in terms of integrators. You need to ask the question when you are contracting a new Alfresco implementation. You need to ask the question, and based on very, very solid details, you'll be able to actually do sizing and proper performance tuning of your platform. We will see later what these details are that allowed us to actually formalize a benchmark process. We said already that out of the box, Alfresco is tuned for evaluation, so you want to know the different components that are involved to be able to tune them accordingly. Once that you set up a performance scenario, if you want, profile, what you're typically interested in is obviously the response time of your Alfresco. That's typically the most intuitive requirements that gets agreed on between the different parts. For example, when you are delivering a project and your client has to accept it. So this is definitely something that we will see in the next slides as a main result, if you want, of a benchmark analysis. Oops. There are other factors around studying scalability and benchmarking, which is definitely, I think, it's important here to do just a little distinction. Many times when I go to customers, they have the tendency to actually mix the concept of stability with the concept of scalability or performance, if you want. My suggestion is obviously you will need to tackle stability problem, either functional from your application or from the infrastructure you're running on, much earlier than going up with very complex load testing. So really understanding how the load and the resources of your environment are actually used is really something that you need to study as part of your performance testing. In terms of the dimensions that we are studying in, obviously there are potentially infinite dimensions to study performance on. But we actually decided to focus on two of the main, if you want, constraints that an ECM implementation has. Yeah? Either the type of content that is in the repository, and that's really something that you need to have a good understanding of, as well as the number of concurrent users that you're going to run on the system. Okay? Obviously, there is another variant, which is the architecture. As you can see, studying the three dimensions together is quite complex. So sometimes you might have to fix a certain architecture and study on the other two dimensions. But we will see how this has been carried out with a greater detail in the next slides. Okay? Now, just the last bit of introduction. Obviously, Alfresco 4 is now out for about a year. I've seen experience in Alfresco 4 obviously growing in the field, but I think that there are certain key areas in which I've still seen some, I would say, confusion or lack of understanding of how really Alfresco 4 can tackle better certain scalability, high, a cloud scale, if you want, scenarios. Well, I just want to do a quick overview of this, just so we are on the same page, and you can understand what really is the reason behind the performances that we will see later, and the benchmark result that we will see later. Obviously, as you mostly should know, Alfresco 4 introduces a separate indexing tier based on Apache Solr. Yeah? So we don't have any more embedded Lucene, but you have a totally independent, transparent, and scalable, independently scalable tier, which also, it's tightly related to the concept of eventual consistency. Meaning, if you've worked with Alfresco in the past, you know that the Lucene index was updated within transactions up until Alfresco 3. Meaning, every time you were writing or updating a content or deleting a content, not only you have to update it in the database, but Alfresco was taking care of updating that in the index. This is not the case anymore. Yeah? Having a separate indexing tier allows Solr to track Alfresco repository at its own pace. Yeah? By default, we have a 15-second period of tracking for Solr. And obviously, this is a big change in the load of the system, the behavior of the system, and also how quick a certain operation can be. Because obviously, when you have to write on a database and then access I/O, typically I/O is what takes more of the time spent on the operation. So this is really a big change that you need to be aware of. Obviously, there are other implications in terms of the implementation, but that's out of the scope of this presentation. This is also something that we introduced as of the first version of Alfresco 4. There's been a big rewriting. Again, this is not the main topic of today, but I just want you to know that as of Alfresco 4, you have the possibility of also scaling out your file system interfaces. Yeah? So we're not going to cover this today, but I'm just leaving it here as a reference. One other, I would say, important change that we have put in place is how we process ACLs, especially during searches. Yeah? For the scope of today, I think it's important to understand that even the ACL evaluation on searches has been moved to the Solr tier, to the indexing tier. If you have worked with Alfresco in the past, you know that Lucene indexes were first returned unfiltered, and then there was a second pass to actually enforce permissions on them, yeah, which caused some counterintuitive behavior, if you want, from Alfresco. So this is now changed, but this means that Solr has to keep track of the ACL information. So Solr, apart from indexing content, is also indexing ACLs to be able to do in-flight query authorization, if you want, query permission filtering. Yeah. So starting from this background, I will just quickly, I'm not going to go through the detail. This is a slide actually from 2 years ago. I think it was New York and Paris 2 years ago, DevCon. So again, not too much into the details, but what I want to show you is that on Alfresco 3, every node creation had a whole set of operations that need to be carried out to actually update the index. And if you look at the same process on Alfresco 4, it's basically there's nothing anymore related to the indexing process. And the same goes for the search. Yeah, that's what I was telling you before. In Alfresco 3, there's first a whole series of steps to retrieve data from Lucene, and then a permission check pass. Now, this is actually quite changed in Alfresco 4, because as soon as the query is actually sent to Solr, Solr will apply an ACL filter on top of obviously matching the content, finding the content that matches the query. Yeah, I'll just again leave this as a reference. I probably will take much more than 50 minutes to also go into these details, but we'll see later that we have already some nice piece of documentation around this stuff. Now, that's the theory. That's how Alfresco 4 was designed. Yeah. So obviously we had, knowing this, we had very good expectations of how Alfresco 4 should perform. But really, in order to, I've been a consultant for a few years. I've been in sales for a few years. I think that it's been, obviously we had great expectation on these changes, but I think proving that was the case with real numbers has been, a very important step forward. So I don't know if this tells anything to you, but I was grown up in a very Catholic country. So this is St. Thomas, and that's the guy who actually, always needs proof to believe in something. So I think this is a good metaphor for, you can definitely trust us when we tell you that Alfresco is scalable, it's super cool, it's wonderful, but I feel much better now that we have numbers, and I'm going to show them to you. Yeah. So a couple of reasons. Obviously, there were product reasons for setting up a benchmarking process to be able to validate all those changes that we've seen, as well as find potential product bottlenecks. From a field standpoint, and obviously this, I think it's more matching what your experience is. How can you leverage benchmarks? Well, you can use them for sizing. You can use them to have a a performance reference when you are implementing at your customer. I mean, if there's a particular scenario that worked in a certain way with a certain average response time, why is it not working in your environment? So I think this is really a great step forward in terms of the safety with which you can implement and deploy Alfresco. So last year I said that we were going to start doing benchmarks this year. As you can see, we actually did, and we it was not just one. We set up a full internal process to actually make sure that benchmarks are executed on a regular basis, as well as, in certain cases, as part of the QA process. So I'm not going to go into the details of each single benchmark. It would probably take us a full day. But we will focus actually on two of these benchmarks, specifically BM001 and BM009. Yeah? Two of, I think, the most interesting in terms of results benchmark that we executed this year. So before going into the details of each, I just want to show you a couple of common factors between the two benchmarks so that you can have a reference. Obviously, we use the same benchmark lab, which we will see in the next slide. It's quite of a high-end physical machines-based benchmark laboratory. We focused on the scenario, on a very specific scenario. We said before there's no one-size-fits-all. There's no concept of general scalability. So what we can talk about today is really scalability on the specific scenario of enterprise collaboration. What does enterprise collaboration mean? Well, basically collaboration on the shared platform. Yeah? So typical document-oriented operation, highly concurrent, with a highly, high number of concurrent users, typical of, worldwide Alfresco deployments. Let's say, for example, in intranet. Yeah. In terms of technologies, we obviously tested on Alfresco Enterprise because our enterprise network is definitely more, interested in this type of very, very large implementations. And JMeter was the technology used to actually run the benchmarks. We will see later on, and just not to create confusions, the current benchmark that we're going to see today were all executed in JMeter, and we will see the details. Derek is going to present later on a new, even much more scalable approach to benchmarking, and we will explain the reason why we make this choice. We made this choice. There are a few differences between the two benchmarks, and we will analyze them. But obviously, both of them really helped us out in terms of understanding how the product behaves and how we can scale it out. Now, I just leave this one as a reference. I'm not going to go, obviously, into all the details of the hardware. But as you can see, we're talking about physical machines. We're talking about 12 cores, 8 to 12 cores machines. So, I mean, I have seen bigger machines in the field. But I would say that we can define those as quite high-end type of machines, also in terms of memory. We really gave the benchmark lab enough room to be able to run different types of benchmarks. Just one thing, and that's really something that you always should remember. You might notice that the disks are of a good quality. The more important thing is really on the index tier, you should always make sure that your disks are as fast as possible, because that's really critical to the performances, definitely of the search tier. Now, let's move into the details of the different benchmarks. Yeah. So BM001 was really a statistic analysis of Alfresco scalability. So the point was not really to go into specific tuning in each single data point that we executed the benchmark against, but it was really to understand how performance or how certain architectural changes would impact performance upon growth on certain dimensions. Yeah. If I can show you the dimensions, probably you'll understand this better. And so as I said before, potentially benchmark has many dimensions to investigate in. So we needed to, freeze that to a manageable set. And so we decided to actually analyze on 3 different dimensions. 2 of them are intuitive, as we discussed before. So it's the number of content items in the repository. And the other one is the number of concurrent users in Alfresco. Yeah? For what regards BM001, we also factor in some architectural changes. So we tested against different number of Alfresco nodes in the cluster, yeah? Just to study how performance would vary across the 3 different dimensions. That's why we have a 3D space, if you want, identified by that. Once we identified the dimensions, we had to identify the data points, yeah? Meaning in each of those dimensions, which value we're actually testing. And yes, you can see how by just selecting 3 or 4 points in one of the dimensions, so these are the amount of content in the repository that we tested against, and this is the number of concurrent users that we tested against. You can see that by then changing also the number of cluster nodes, we get to an explosion of tests, meaning we have at least 27 tests in this case to be run, 27 runs of the benchmark to be run. So you can see how this can be arbitrarily complex. Now, just to give you a bit more of detail, we said before it's fundamental to understand the scenario. Otherwise, there's no real point into studying scalability. Well, this was the scenario that we actually run for the first benchmark. You can find the JMeter scripts that are publicly available on the Alfresco Open Mirror. So these are JMeter scripts that you can run yourself. And that's the way you can realize a comparison, a reference with what we are showing today. One thing that I really urge to try and understand when you are deploying Alfresco is not just how many concurrent users, what type of content is in there, but is also what are these users doing? Especially now that Alfresco has different components dealing with the repository and dealing, for example, with searches. Unless you know what's your split in terms of read, not just read and write, but even read, search, and write. Yeah, I know it's a difficult information to pull out, and obviously this is a posteriori. So we define the test, and I can tell you what they're doing. But this is really fundamental because the split between read and search will impact basically which tier you want to scale, whether it's Solr or is the repository tier. I think that's pretty intuitive. But just for you to know, if you get the chance to get this from your customers or in terms of starting a project, that's a good thing. Now, we said, what I didn't say, I think it's quite important, is that this scenario has a 48% search, which means that half of the time users are issuing searches. As you can see, this is a very search intensive, stressy for the indexing tier. And in fact, I'm going to just be brief here, but on our top data point, so almost 1,100 users and 10 million nodes, we had to scale up to 4 Solr nodes to actually support that. Yeah? So this is the number of Solr nodes that we used throughout the benchmark. The architecture, it is, I think, pretty standard if you look at the deployment of Alfresco 4. We had 3 client tiers executing the JMeters, passing through one single node for share, that through a load balancer will go from 1 to 4 Alfresco nodes in cluster. And once again, through the load balancer, Alfresco would connect to one to 4 Solrs, okay? One thing that I want to notice here, it's probably not that clear from the picture, but there was an additional Alfresco instance deployed on the Solr nodes. This is just dedicated for tracking, yeah? So it's not accessed by front-end. It is only accessed by Solr for tracking purposes. We will see that this has given us some very interesting results in terms of separating the concerns of serving front-end users and tracking content. In terms of software, again, this is more as a reference. Not going to go into details. BM001 was executed on Postgres, Tomcat, and Alfresco 4.0.0. Yeah, just for you as a reference, so you can see the difference with BM009. And actually, these are the results. I don't think we have time to go in every single result, but what I think it's important for you to have a look is probably the bottom right corner of this table, in which you can see that even with almost 1,100 concurrent users executing operations every 10 seconds, that was the think time, and with 10 million documents in the repository, we were able to have an average response time still around 1.5 seconds. So I think this has been a great validation of the great work done by the engineers to get to Alfresco 4, and allow us to reach levels of scalability that were not achievable before. Yes, not in seconds. And in my original version of the paper, I actually forgot I put seconds instead of milliseconds. I think people were a little bit shaken. So I think that the main conclusions really from this first benchmark was that Alfresco rocks. So that was the short conclusion. Obviously, we had some more detailed conclusions, and I'm just trying to speed up as we will soon run out of time. As I said, we were able to stably run 1,100 concurrent users. We, understood the importance of the read-search split, because we noticed that, by adding Solr nodes, we were able to go up and scale much more because the scenario was really search intensive. And we also noticed that Solr can be memory intensive. So make sure that you give enough memory to the indexing tier, as we understood before, that now the indexing tier does a lot, does also the ACL checks. And that's a big thing, especially in corporate environment where potentially the ACLs are very complex. As I said, we noticed also that having Alfresco dedicated tracking has been beneficial for this benchmark, especially in terms of separating concern, operational advantages. If you are an enterprise customer, you have or a partner, you have access to a full study of Alfresco 4 scalability and of the benchmark results. Yeah, this is published in the Alfresco support site. We have been writing this, and I really suggest you to have a look at it. Not because I wrote it, but just because it's quite useful to actually. It's a very extended description of why and what has changed in Alfresco 4. Now, briefly, before leaving the stage to Derek, which is gonna, show us actually the cool stuff. Just a quick overview of the other benchmark that we run. There was a more recent benchmark. Obviously, we learned from the experience of and from the pains that we had to suffer in certain cases with the second benchmark. And what we did, really the objective for this one is having a more real-life scenario in terms of repository, in terms of test loading script, as well as in terms of configuration. We have a more standard deployment of 2 Alfresco and 2 Solrs. So we really wanted to see, this is not a scalability benchmark, it's not a statistic study, it's really, let's take a configuration, let's see what we can get there. As I said, the objective was to be more realistic. We made a more realistic scenario. Typically, when you study scalability, or in general, the read-write split is about normally 80-20, it's already quite active. Normally it's 90-10. As you can see in this case, we have about 85 reads and just a much smaller number of searches, yeah? So a much more realistic one. Again, too many details. I'm not going to flood with those, but as I said, apart from the scenario, also the repository had to be really much more realistic. So we filled it with any, very common aspect that is used of Alfresco in a typical collaboration scenario. So lots of groups, lots of users, lots of memberships. It is really something that we wanted to be working in the field. In terms of architecture, we have pretty much the same architecture that we've seen before, also with Alfresco dedicated on Solr. So we, able to use pretty much the same configuration. And in terms of software, obviously Alfresco was a later version, so this is for 1.1.2, and we use MySQL instead of Postgres, so to explore even other database options. In terms of results, considering that the repository was much more loaded in terms of users, considering that the scripts were enhanced to actually mimic much better shared behavior, I think that these results, even with 500 concurrent users, being able to have a 1.2 average, in terms of 1.2 seconds average, I think this has been a very, very satisfying results. And obviously, once again, Alfresco rocks. Now, other little takeaways. Again, obviously, we got to this, and that was already an achievement by itself. But we noticed that the dedicated Alfresco are really useful, especially for operational purposes. For example, suppose that you want to disable full text indexing, yeah, or disable transformation. Having a separate back-end Alfresco rather than your front-end Alfresco allows you to do separate configurations for the two Alfrescos without impacting, for example, user experience. So this is, from an operational standpoint, much better. I will leave you with some general tips. I hope you know already about checking your open files. I hope that you know that you got to allow enough connections in your DB. Definitely enough Tomcat server. Maybe sometimes what we also stumbled on is disabling the antivirus. That was a crazy thing on the index. We had some antivirus software running as a service on Red Hat, and that was killing the performance of the server, of the indexing server, because it's doing huge amount of I/O. So maybe make sure that that is out of the picture. There are many things that if you look at the scalability paper, there are many tuning parameters you can have a look at. But obviously, making sure that Alfresco and Solr have enough resources to see each other, and as well as to access the support components like DB and I/O on an optimized way, that is definitely something that you need to consider. I'm closing, and yes, JMeter was a good exercise, but it's very memory intensive. It didn't scale enough, and now that we know how cool and scalable Alfresco is, we actually needed to set up something that was able to benchmark at cloud scale. So without further ado, I will let Derek go on with the benchmark framework that I think is going to be quite exciting. Thank you.
It's all right. Longer. No, yeah, it's fine. Okay. Right. Thanks, Gab. I think Gab did actually introduce me. I'm one of the founding engineers for Alfresco and on the repository team, and more recently on the benchmarking team. So I'll try and keep my slides quick. I don't have a lot of them, and then hopefully we can get to some demos. Just a little bit of history. I apologize. I'll just skim over that. You don't need to know the details. We've had a bit of a patchy history in terms of benchmarking, but quite far back we did benchmarks for 100 million documents on a Unisys supplied environment for us. We've had QA involvement in benchmarking, but it's always been a little bit ad hoc and, shall we say, responding to problems rather than actually approaching things and trying to be ahead of the curve all the time. So mid-2011, sort of getting ready for the Alfresco 4 release, we commissioned the big machines which Gab mentioned. Late 2011, we had a failed attempt to get JMeter to simulate share from a high level. So we actually wasted some engineering time on that. Not to say we couldn't have done it, because it has in fact been done, but we just had a bit of pain with that. We also did our first 4.0 architecture benchmark, which is the benchmark 1, as Gab mentioned. So it's pretty much at this point that everyone realized we actually needed to formalize these projects and really get everything controlled. And that's pretty much the role that I started taking over. So the benchmark lead role was created, so that's me. And one of the first things I did was having seen people suffer, shall I say, and suffered at the hands of, well, JMeter is a good tool. I don't want to diss it, but it has limitations, especially with respect to actually trying to drive a share interface, for instance. Really the kind of thing that you want is to actually drive it from a real browser. It's pretty complicated when you try and simulate all the AJAX requests and URLs that get called. So we went through an evaluation of different benchmark technologies, and also pretty much at the same time we executed on a few other benchmark tests. So that's not really the subject of the talk. What I wanted to get to, there's a little diagram of some of the benchmark projects. Gab has already shown that in the other slide. So we the list of things which we would like from a benchmarking infrastructure, these are just some of them, right? And if you sat down and you didn't think about what was out there, you just wrote down the kind of things you want, then obviously the first thing is you want a real browser. If you're going to test share, just test it using a browser. And people are probably familiar with the browser tools that are out there to do this. Of course, one of the other things that you need is, especially when you've got a cloud service that's running share, is we really need to be able to simulate thousands of browser sessions. This might not be extremely active users. In fact, probably most users aren't extremely active through share, but we've also got mobile applications, we've got public API, and all of these things mixed together. So we really need to be able to scale out to kind of literally thousands of sessions, all pointing at one server. And as Gab mentioned, JMeter is quite resource intensive, and also you have the issue of, well, let's just get to the results. The other thing is, if you do manage to scale out your tests to 50 servers or something like that, you really need a way to collate the results, and you need a centralized point for all of these things, so that you need to be able to search them, you need to be able to do real-time data analysis, all of that kind of stuff. So that's definitely one of the requirements. The other thing was tests, and this we really suffered from in the early days, you don't really know whether your scripts, your JMeter scripts and other type of scripts really, you don't know that they're going to work until you actually run them. And even then, some of the background operations that you simulate might actually not be working and you might not notice. So really what you want to do is treat these things as real software. Actually, projects that, you know, they need to run in an integration environment, and you need to see, you know, you know, the green bar has gone red and your server is no longer compatible with whatever release of your server has just gone out. So that was another one. Reusable code, as you know, if you're copy-pasting these kind of test scripts and stuff, that's a big one. Another big one that we suffered from, I'm sure you're all aware of it, if you run one test and you run another test and you stop it halfway, and then you bring in some other tests, really each one of these tests has no idea what's just happened on the server, and you end up in a situation where you're having to drop the server and recreate your test data right from the beginning again in order to get it pristine. And very often we found, well, we think we're only going to need 100,000 sites, but just in case, let's create 120,000. And when you get there, you discover, well, actually, it's not enough, so you hack your script to create another 10,000. You know, it adds a lot of time to your, a lot of development time, and actually the test time just increases a lot, especially when you get to really complicated and high volume scenarios. So some other things you can look through, execution, really you just want to go somewhere remote and you just want to say run. And that's really what you want. You want to be able to say pause it. Maybe your server's not configured correctly, so you want to pause your test, drop your server, change something, bring it back up, and just continue with the test. So these are all ideals. And so having done that and deciding that actually there isn't really anything out there to do this kind of thing, there may be something like that, but we couldn't find anything that's free. So, well, you know, the constraints. So I'll admit there's another excuse in that, as you'll see from the architecture drawing, there's some cool things in here which are nice to play with. So I admit that I was drawn to it. So this is the kind of architecture I went for. Basically, Zookeeper is controlling our configuration. So everything, we have a little client sitting at the top, which is where you come in with your test. And in this case, it's just a command line client, but it could be a user interface. It talks to Zookeeper to set up configuration. You even upload jars. You upload configuration. That's where you interact. It can go to MongoDB to analyze the results, to get the graphs and download the results and all of that kind of stuff that you want. Of course, you can go to MongoDB anytime you want and just do whatever you want, but the client provides some of the stuff for you. Then we have the scalable architecture where every single server, benchmark server that starts up is completely independent of every other benchmark server, and they pick up their events from the Mongo database, they write their results to the Mongo database. We use Mongo in this case to store stuff like what users are on the system. Have they been created? Have they not been created? Are they in the middle of a sign-up process? What's the state of the sign-up process? So if a user is halfway signed up, they've been invited, but they haven't accepted the invite, the test knows this kind of thing. So it's able to say, well, let's just pick up where we left off and finish the invite for the user. So that's the broad level structure. It's not specific to Alfresco in any way. That's why the green bar at the bottom is there's some cloudy stuff, whatever you want to test, presumably remotely, obviously. We include WebDriver, the Selenium stuff in the server by default. So, and in our particular instances, we've installed headless X sessions, what you'd call them, you know, to drive Firefox in headless mode. Okay, so I don't know if you. I can obviously see where this is going. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. So, but we don't really have time, unfortunately. I have exactly 1 minute to do a demo. Does anybody want to see a demo of something working? Yeah, all right, okay, so let's do that. So what I've done is one of our big machines that we've got, Alfresco Tier 1 up here, I've got 2 benchmark servers running. So if I go back to this diagram, I've got Alfresco Tier 1 is running one benchmark server, Alfresco Tier 2 is running another benchmark server, and I've got an Alfresco instance running nearby. So what I want to do is I want to use one of our benchmark tests to actually test the activity. We have a remote activity test. So it'll create a workflow, it'll progress the workflow and do some stuff. So I just want to show you how easy it is to set the thing up. Well, the first thing to do perhaps is to go and look and see my, I've got green bars on all the servers and everything like that. So I've just downloaded one of the latest benchmark servers. I've started up my client, which is you have to excuse it, I gravitate to the command line. So I've written a command line client just to interact and drive the thing. So I've connected to this cluster of servers that have connected up. If I look here, you can see that basically 2 servers running, and they started some time ago. There are no tests deployed, so I'm going to create a test. I'm just going to call it demo. So one of the things I need to just do is upload the jar. This is a jar that comes straight out of a Maven build, so it's gone through its tests and everything. We know that it's compatible with this version of the server. So I'm going to upload the default properties, and I'm going to upload the Spring configuration. Okay. So if I go back, 2 servers running. They just basically parked there waiting. There's still actually nothing happening as far as they're concerned. So one of the nice things that I really wanted to do was every single time I run a test, I want to be able to override the default properties for that specific time that I run the test. I don't want to have to change properties, run it, change the same properties, run it. You create a new test instance, you change the properties, you override your properties, and then that's it. Next time you want to run it again, you create another test instance. So this is the test definition, and I'm going to just change the server that it goes to. So in this case, that's the server name. Okay. What else is there to change? Nothing. Right. So I want to create an instance of this test. I create a 1. I'm not going to change any of the default properties. I'm just going to say show properties now. I've pointed it. So as you can see, there's an order of precedence here in terms of properties. The cluster properties are overridden by the test properties, are overridden by your specific test run properties. In this case, I'm going to go with the default number of users and so on. So I'm going to issue the load command. Now, what we've seen here happening is that actually the benchmark servers have immediately picked up that this test has now become active. And I'm going to start it. That's really it. Now the test is running. At the bottom there, you can't really see it, but it says event processing has started. And that's pretty much it. Right? It's not 100% successful. That's just a little Mongo slip on my part. But nevertheless, off it's going. The other thing we can do now is, because while it's running, I can say to it, let's see 1,000 results on a chart. And this is live. This is running live straight out of the results table in MongoDB. I have to really finish up. If I go and look at the Mongo database collections, you can see we've got an events queue, we've got a results queue, and the other concept which I mentioned before, the sharing of data. We've actually got 2 collections there called, they're both prefixed with the term mirror. They're mirrors to that specific Alfresco server. So in this case, I've got 200 users. And there's my collection of users. If I run another test, which also needed a collection of users, it would already know that Alfresco, that specific server of Alfresco has 200 users in it. So if there was a pre-step to create 400 users, it would go off and create a few more 100 users. So let me just kill this. Right, so that's finished. Yeah, we're done? Okay. Sorry, guys. That's it. But if anybody else wants to see it carry on, you're welcome to come and ask. So the bottom line is that's where we're going in terms of providing a tool which really should come out of a build environment and which you'll be able to hopefully deploy and use to solve the one-size-fits-all issue. Right.